To speak on the government's bill to abolish the elected councillors from Environment Canterbury, a bill that we're debating under urgency and is going to be pushed through the middle of the night without proper democratic process. Mr. Speaker, at the opening of this Parliament, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The government will take action this year to remove regulatory roadblocks to water storage and irrigation in Canterbury," end quote. This bill is the fulfilment of that promise because the government believes that democracy is an obstacle to irrigation in Canterbury. The government believes that agribusiness and the irrigation companies who have become aggrieved at the Regional Council for stopping some of their projects has got in the way. And so the government is getting rid of democracy in Canterbury by getting rid of the elected Regional Council. Now, what do you do when you can't get your own way? What do you do? What does one do when you can't get your way? What a person does is you get rid of the obstacle. So when the irrigation companies and agribusiness got annoyed with the Regional Council, they went to the government and said, "Can you get rid of this Regional Council for us?" And the government tonight, forcing through under urgency, is going to sack the Regional Council. It's an interesting thing that we had a debate over the last few weeks about whether one should have one person, one vote. Well, the government tonight is moving to one person, no vote in Canterbury. Tonight they are abolishing democracy in Canterbury for 3.5 years. It sounds like something that Commodore Frankenbeini Marama in Fiji would do when he said, "We're just going to abolish democracy for a little while, but we'll bring it back again later." Mr Anderson earlier said there should be no taxation without representation. The people of Canterbury are now going to be taxed through their rates and have absolutely no say about how their taxes will be spent. The people of Canterbury, 500,000 people roughly, have had their democratic rights or are about to have their democratic rights taken away from them. There is no Royal Commission, as there was in Auckland, if you want to compare it to the Auckland example. There are no Select Committee hearings, as there were during the Auckland, with all the problems of the Auckland problem. And it's going to be forced through on the people of Canterbury, 500,000 people, overnight under urgency in this House. Now, of course, the whole thing that justifies it, the fig leaf that's used, is the so-called Creech Report. Now, the Creech Report was headed up by a director from a dairy company with multiple convictions for water pollution, and it worked for about 3 weeks. I think it had 3.5 weeks the review went for. It interviewed about 20 stakeholders, and actually, as a matter of fact, the Creech Report, amongst other things, concluded that there was, quote, "no fundamental dysfunction," which was an interesting conclusion for the Creech Report on which all of this is based. There was no fundamental dysfunction. And one of the interesting things about the Creech Report was that it criticised the Regional Council for being too pro-science. It said the Regional Council is basing too many decisions on science. That was the outrage. That was the criticism. It was science-led rather than science-informed. That's what the Creech Report criticised the Regional Council for, paying too much heed to science and not enough heed to the irrigation companies. It also criticised the Regional Council for being an obstacle to economic growth. This is one of the regions that has grown fastest in New Zealand as a result of the dramatic increase in irrigation in the Canterbury region. And in fact, if you look at the RMA, which is obviously something this government very seldom does, you'll see that it talks about sustainable management. It's not supposed to be there for endless, unlimited economic growth with no constraints whatsoever. So for the Creech Report to criticise the Regional Council for taking the environment into account means that the Creech Report does not understand the Resource Management Act, which is supposed to take the environment into account. That's the whole purpose of sustainable development and responsible management of the environment, is to take the environment into account. And that's what ECAN was being criticised for in the Creech Report. It's also notable that in the last 12 months, ECAN processed nearly 90% of resource consents within statutory timelines. Of course, they're being criticised because during one period they only processed 29%, and yet now, just as they're about to be abolished, they're processing about 90% of resource consents within statutory timeframes. That's the right time to abolish them, isn't it? What a brilliant time to abolish them, just as they're doing well. Forest and Bird calls this bill the fast track for dams, and of course that's what this bill is. This bill is an attack on the water conservation order process around the Hurunui. Currently that process is on its way to the Environment Court. It was supposed to be there in May to hear the appeals. This bill will cut the water conservation order on the Hurunui off at the knees because the water conservation order might have got in the way of the irrigators, and that is unacceptable because, as John Key told us, he's going to remove regulatory roadblocks to water storage and irrigation in Canterbury, so we can't possibly have a water conservation order on the Hurunui River so that it would stop us building a big dam across the Hurunui River. The other, of course, problem is that the people of Christchurch, aside from having their democratic rights taken away from this bill, are also going to have their clean water taken away by this bill. Currently, Christchurch is fortunate to have very good water supplies, potable water supplies which are untreated. Already there are small amounts of nitrogen appearing in that water, and as irrigation expands, because as John Key says, we've got to get rid of regulatory roadblocks to irrigation, as irrigation expands and pollution expands, goodbye Christchurch's clean water supply. And also the water conservation order on the Rakaya River is also a target of this government. It wants to break the water conservation order on the Rakaya River so that it can access that water for irrigation as well. This bill, aside from being an attack on democratic oversight of executive government, is also an attack on judicial oversight of democratic government. The water conservation order, which normally would go to the Environment Court so that judiciary can have some say on this process, that has been cut off. The water conservation order will no longer go to the Environment Court for judicial oversight. The Natural Resource Regional Plan. Now, the Natural Resource Regional Plan will no longer have access on points of content as opposed to points of law to the Environment Court. So that particular aspect of judicial oversight of regional government and the regional executive will be removed. Water conservation orders, it's not very well known, they are the national parks for rivers. So just as the government wants to mine national parks, wants to mine the conservation estate and the Schedule 4 lands within it, they also want to mine the national parks for rivers, which are the water conservation orders. They want to get rid of the water conservation orders so that they can take the water that's currently protected in the Rakaya and put it into irrigation schemes so that they can give lots of money to the big dairy companies and the irrigators, add lots of pollution to the groundwater and the surface water in Canterbury. Now, these water conservation orders are a problem for the government and the irrigators and the dairy corporations. But if you want to protect the environment, they're very important. So when the government intervenes, as the Parliament's going to tonight and tomorrow under urgency, to basically interrupt the water conservation order process, you fundamentally threaten the national parks for rivers in our country. Water conservation orders are national parks for rivers in our country. They are put there to be an absolute protection for rivers, and this government is tonight moving in to overturn water conservation orders because they see them as an obstacle to irrigation. Now the moratorium on new water takes and at-risk catchments, giving the power to implement a moratorium is a good idea, but why didn't you give it to the regional councillors and to ECAN? They've been begging for this power for years. Brian Jenkins has been begging to have this power, but time and again governments of both flavours have refused to give it to him, and actually it's become a real problem. It is, of course, one of the great paradoxes that at the same time as they're giving them a moratorium to suspend resource consent processing, in particular catchments, the main reason they're giving for sacking ECAN is that they took too long to process resource consents, which is one of the great paradoxes of it. If you really wanted to give the moratorium power, and I support that, then you should have given it to the regional council who are finally getting their act together. Finally, a word about Ministry for the Environment. If we're going to sack ECAN, we should sack the Ministry for the Environment. The Ministry for the Environment are just as big a failure as Environment Canterbury, because for 19 years they haven't produced national policy statements or national environmental standards. If we're going to sack ECAN, we should sack MFE. They're just as bad and just as responsible. We are moving from an era of malign neglect under the previous government and the one before that, the malign neglect of rivers, to malign attention. So over the previous government, rivers were kind of left to get dirtier. Now they're going to accelerate the process. We are ramming it through in the middle of the night so that the Prime Minister can do just as he said at his opening to Parliament. This government will take action to remove regulatory roadblocks to irrigation in Canterbury, and that's what this bill's for.
Honourable Rod.